are ready to go. Let's learn about inventory and PO generator. Take it away.
All right, thanks Kim. Hello everyone. And as Kim mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about inventory and how it integrates with PO generator, where we can have the system kind of do some thinking for us. And so I don't have too many slides. We're going to spend the bulk of the time actually showing you what has to be done in the product and how it gets set up and how it works. But we're going to run through just a kind of a few concepts here before we jump over to Dynamics GP. So what is PO generator? Well, it's actually got a very logical name. It's a module in the software that actually will suggest purchase orders and generate those for us. And so, and I do stress suggest, it doesn't force us to purchase based on intelligence in the system, but it does go through and look at the inventory levels, and we'll talk about kind of what it's actually looking at here in just a minute. And then it makes suggestions that we can edit, of course, and then send on to automatically create a number of purchase orders, so we don't have to do those one by one. And so again, we're going to focus on kind of some of the setup options that have to be done to get PO generator to actually generate and to use the intelligence that it's designed to have. And then we'll actually generate a couple of POs and talk about some warnings and errors when things maybe don't go the way that we expect them to. And so the idea is that we don't have to go one by one and manually figure out what purchase orders should be created, that we want the software to look at the demand on our particular inventory items and then offer up, based on some rules, some suggested purchase order quantities that we might be able to proceed and actually create purchase orders from. And so we're going to look at things like order point and order up to level and talk about the differences between those and where we need to set those to have PO generator actually use that intelligence that it has. And so there's some setup that has to be done in the vendors, of course, because we're creating purchase orders. And of course, the more of this we set up, the more complete our purchasing suggestions will be. Some of these are optional, some of these are required. And so, if an item doesn't have a vendor or a preferred vendor, or default vendor, then, PO generator is going to maybe suggest a quantity to purchase, but without a vendor attached, it's not going to be complete. We're going to have to add that. And so the more we can do in our basic setup, then the more PO generator is going to streamline the process and save us a bunch of time. Of course, we need to have items assigned to sites, and if we have more than one site, we want to make sure the items go into the right site. And you'll see in a minute why that's important, because PO generator actually looks at the site that the item resides in, or can expand across all sites. And so we want to make sure we have those things correct. And our vendor setup, of course, we want to have the address, the vendor in the kind of the ship from address that we're going to buy from. Other simple things that we probably all have anyway already in our system is credit limits with vendors, and if a vendor has a minimum order on an item and so forth. And so some of that, if we're using inventory and if we're using payables today, we probably have most of those things in there. But I'm going to point out, once we flip over to GP, those things that you might not have. And then of course on the item card, on our inventory items, cost is important. So the last time we purchased an item from a particular vendor, we should have the cost in there, and that would come from the receipt and the invoice transaction, the last purchase of an item from a particular vendor. And of course, that's important because we might buy the same item from multiple vendors, but each vendor most likely has a slightly different cost for the exact same item that we're purchasing. And so we want to make sure we get the right cost into the right vendor attached to that item. And then if we're using the ABC analysis or the codes on items, that is not required to use. That's one option to have the system suggest purchasing, but that is not at all required to be able to use a PO generator. And then of course we want to make sure that we know the default purchasing unit of measure, and so if we buy in one unit, maybe we buy in cases but we sell in eaches or individual lots. We want to make sure we have those conversions set up, and again, not required, but when we get to the PO we're going to have to then stop and say I want to buy individuals or I want to buy cases. And so the more of this we can get in there on the front side, then the smoother PO generator is going to be able to look at our data and provide us with the suggested quantities to purchase. And then of course the last thing is purchasing either in whole or fractional units. And so most of the time we have the system set to purchase in whole units, but you know, sometimes depending on what the item is, sometimes we can break that down into fractions, and so we can buy a piece of a unit, in other words. And so on the vendor, this looks like a lot. It's really not. You probably have, if you have inventory already, you probably have some or most of this set up right now. And so we'll look at the vendor setup here. A lot of this is in one or two screens, and so there's really, it's not as bad as what it looks like, even though it's a long list. The EOQ, by the way, sometimes people ask, what's EOQ? Economic order quantity. That's the optimal quantity that you would buy from a vendor. So, and that takes into account a lot of different things, and not to kind of derail into a cost accounting discussion here, but the EOQ looks at, of course, the vendor's price, the shipping cost, the handling cost. If I receive the item and I don't have anywhere to put it, maybe I have to put it in a public warehouse, and so, you know, I might have a good price on the item, so I pre-buy for the season coming up, maybe for summer. But if I have to pay somebody to store those items because I don't have space, you know, is that really worth it? And so that gets into more of kind of an accounting equation and formula on what that EOQ is. A lot of people outside of manufacturing don't typically get into calculating that, and so if that looks like it's a foreign topic, that's perfectly okay. There's not a whole lot of people that probably use that. And so the last thing is really the item resource planning, and this is really where the brains, so to speak, of PO generator actually come in, is what number in the system should it look at to actually figure out what to buy. And so that's really what we're telling it in the item resource planning. And this may be a screen that you have not used yet, or maybe have opened and not really known what to do, or maybe you entered some data and you notice it doesn't really do much. You don't really know where that data shows up and how it works. And so we'll spend a couple of minutes on that screen once we flip over to the system here and talk through these different options and where you may or may not use some of these things. And so with that, I think we are, in case you forgot who I am, we're going to kill off the PowerPoint here for the time being and spend the rest of the time in the software. And so this is Microsoft Dynamics GP 2016 R2, and so this is the most current release of the product. It's going to look a lot like 2015 and quite a bit like 2013, and so this PO generator has been in the system, I think, since version 10. I'm kind of going from memory there, but I know it was in version 10, and so it's been around a while and really kind of came out the way it is today. And so way back in version 10 when it shipped, PO generator hasn't really changed an awful lot. They may have added a flag or two to the setting, but for the most part it was pretty functional when it was developed. And so the first thing we want to do is take a look at our purchasing setup, and so I'm just going to go, and I'm kind of driving the old-fashioned way here. I'll flip over to a more modern way where we go to the actual area page here when we start looking at the screens, but I'm going to go into setup and purchasing, and then I'm going to go into my purchase order processing setup. And so this is our normal POP or purchase order processing screen, so nothing unusual here, and we're not going to really talk through any of these. So, but when I get down to the options area here, when I click on the options button, you'll notice that I've got in 2/3 of the screen here, I've got choices that really surround the PO generator. And so we want to make sure that we think through these when we're setting this up. The first one is the order method. And so in the order method, we've got a couple of choices, two to be exact. We've got the order to the independent site or order to a master site. And so, well, what's the difference? An independent site means that the PO generator is going to look at and suggest POs for every item based on the site that that item resides in. And so if you have an item stored in multiple sites, it will look site by site and see what do we need for site A versus site B versus site C. And so we're looking at our individual warehouse locations or site locations. The master site option would allow us to kind of consolidate, so company-wide look at all of our sites, and the idea is that we probably send a purchase order out to the vendor and we receive that product into a master site. So we might have centralized receiving is really what that is, and then from that master site we kind of break that down and move that out to the separate or sub-locations that we might actually sell or warehouse this product in. And so really that's just a choice that whatever fits your business. Most people I think tend to do the independent site when they're purchasing, where they initiate a purchase order, it has a ship to of each individual warehouse location, and the goods show up into that individual warehouse location versus a centralized receiving, and then we truck those parts across the country to our different locations. And so I've got mine set to independent site. And so the next one is the replenishment level. And so here is where those order point and order up to levels come in. And so order point quantity, you don't necessarily have to get overly hung up on what they named this, but the order point quantity tells Dynamics GP, the PO generator, to order up to this order point quantity field, and that's going to be in that item resource planning window, which we're going to look at here in a minute. But we're going to go to that item resource planning window, we're going to find the order point quantity field, and then PO generator is going to look at that field and order up to that point. And so if we have less than that available, not necessarily on the shelf, not on hand, but available, then PO generator is going to suggest a buy of the difference. The order up to level is virtually the same thing, except we're going to look at a different field. And so on that item resource planning window, there's a different field called order up to level. And PO generator will look at the inventory levels, and it will bring the quantity up. It'll suggest a buy based on that order up to level as it's defined in the resource planning window. There's one little caveat though. If the order up to level is 0 or less than the order point quantity, then the order point quantity will always be used. Now that sounds probably confusing, but I'm going to show you how this works, and so I think you'll see it that it is somewhat simple when we actually get into it. And then the vendor economic order quantity, that's what we were just talking about, is if we decide to use the EOQ, then the PO generator will look at the vendor EOQ for that item, and it will suggest purchases based on that EOQ level. And so, you know, if the system is saying, hey, we're out of stock and we need 2 of these, if the vendor for that item has an EOQ of 6, the PO generator will suggest 6, even though we only need 2. Now, if we need 6 and the EOQ is 6, then we're good, but it will always increase the suggested purchase from what we really need up to the EOQ level. And so that's one way to get the system to really look at a different field. And so then when we get into the vendor selection, we have to tell the system, do we want to use the site's primary vendor. So when we buy this item from this location, so this warehouse, this is our vendor. And most of you probably know, if you've worked with inventory, that we can have a different primary vendor for every inventory site or location that we house a product at. And so we might buy the exact same product from vendor A. If it's coming out of our Seattle warehouse, we buy that identical product from vendor B if it comes from our New York warehouse. And so we just have to tell PO Generator, do you prefer it look at the site's primary vendor or the vendor with the lowest cost? So it doesn't matter where it is coming from. If we have a warehouse in New York and we have a vendor in New York, but a vendor in Seattle is the lowest cost, then PO Generator would suggest a buy from the vendor in Seattle. Or if I need it really, really quick, I can look for the vendors with the shortest lead time and suggest buys based on who can get it to me the quickest. And so those are really our choices. I'm going to leave mine set to the primary vendor. That's kind of how I typically buy things. And then the cost, we have to tell the system, do you want to look at the cost that this vendor charged you the last time you bought this item from this location? That's how I have mine set today. We could have it provide us the cost of the current inventory cost. So in other words, it doesn't matter where I bought it. The last time I bought this item, ignore the vendor. I want to use the item's current cost, so most recent cost, regardless of where I made the purchase. Or I could use the standard cost, which in Dynamics GP is a user-defined field, so you go in and change the item's standard cost unless you have manufacturing installed, and then of course manufacturing can help manage that standard cost. But without the manufacturing module turned on and running, then the users actually update the standard cost. Except at year-end close, which you can have the current cost be written into the standard cost field. So in case there's somebody that's knows that little fact and wanted to point out that I omitted that. So, or we can put in a specified cost. If our cost information is really old and we don't want it to look at anything, we can just say, here's what I think I am going to buy that for. So I'm going to have mine look at the vendor's cost the last time I bought that item. And then really the only last things here are when we look at the stock levels, the inventory levels of our items, do we want to consider allocation? So yes, most people do. You want to consider what's allocated. And so, if you have 25 on the shelf, but 20 of them are sitting on an order or an invoice that's not yet posted, it's usually a good idea to say those 20 are probably going out the door pretty quick. So I only really have 5 that I can rely on here. I don't have the 25 that are still, quote, on hand. Same thing with back order. So, if I want the PO Generator to view all back orders for a particular item, and a back order means that we don't have it, right? So we can have the system include those into what it should buy. So, so in other words, back ordered quantity plus either my order up to level or my order point quantity, and then figure out kind of how much I need. And then the last checkbox there is non-purchased requisitions. And so if you happen to be using the requisition module in Dynamics GP, if it has an item on it that is not yet purchased, do we want to consider the quantity that the requisitions might be asking for as well when we make our purchase recommendation? And so I do have mine checked, so I do want to look at any requisitions that are not converted to POs, so kind of an open requisition, and I want the system to include those quantities for a particular item in my suggestion. And of course, it's just a suggestion. I can always up or down, increase or decrease the suggested quantity, but that's kind of the logic of what the PO Generator is going out into the software and looking at those different data points. And then the very last thing is, do we want to create a purchase order, one purchase order per ship to address? I have mine set to yes. That you don't have to do that, but that really is when you have a vendor that has multiple items in the PO suggestions, but they're all shipping to the same site or warehouse location. On my side, do I want to roll those into one PO? If I uncheck that box, I'll get a separate PO for every item, even though it's going to the same site. And so that's really up to you on kind of how you want to manage that. So really that's all there is really to the basic setup of PO Generator. But next, remember we had some item card setup things that we needed to look at. So let's flip over to an item card, and let's just, I think I've got some here on this 2G. Yeah, so the 2 gigahertz processor. You can tell this is very old because we would never buy a 2 gigahertz processor now. And so there's several things here that we want to make sure we have. And so the main thing is that every item needs to be assigned to a warehouse, and so we want to make sure that that is the case. And so when I bring up my my main warehouse here, we want to make sure that we do have an item assigned to a warehouse. We want to make sure, not required, but again, it's going to save a ton of time when we do PO Generator. We want to make sure that we have a primary vendor. And so what this is telling PO Generator is when I buy this item, this 2 gigahertz processor, out of the central warehouse, or just warehouse in my example, this is the vendor that I'm going to default to. So if I leave this blank, PO Generator still runs, it still suggests quantity, it does everything it needs to, but it will give us an error because it doesn't know the vendor, and so we will have to stop and then decide which vendor we want to use and then plug that in so PO Generator can actually then move the suggested quantities over to real purchase orders. And so so that's again, it's not gonna crash, but it is gonna stop and make you fill that in. So I like to fill that in on the item card where it's appropriate, and more times than not, I buy this item when I'm ordering from warehouse, from advanced office. And so once we get those in, that's a pretty good start to the item setup here. But then the last thing here is the planning button, and this is probably the screen that most of you probably have not gone into maybe ever, and if you did, this maybe looked a little foreign, and you probably said, you know, that's not stuff that I would use, and so just continued to close it out and never open it again. And so, but this is important when we use PO Generator. And so what I have here is selected in my warehouse. So if I just bring up default values, you see that there's not a whole lot happening here, and that's okay. But PO Generator actually uses the individual sites based on my setup, because I said I wanted to have PO Generator work on a warehouse by warehouse location. And so that's why these fields are now important. If I was ordering into a master site, then we're not going to look at this information. We're just going to, you know, buy everything and receive it into our central store and then kind of dole it out from there. And so when this item is in this site called warehouse, I've selected in a buyer. That's purely optional. But I did that because it was out there. But this is the key piece that we need right here is if you're having trouble with PO Generator and you think all the criteria are met to actually generate a purchase order, and PO Generator is not suggesting any quantities to buy, it just completely ignores your item, there's probably about a 99% chance that the problem is right here in this field, that you have it set to not planned. And so you must turn this on to tell Dynamics that this item should be considered in the purchasing suggestions when PO Generator is run. And so you have to have this use PO Generator turned on for the item for the site. And so that is almost 99 or 100% of the time the problem when PO Generator is not properly pulling your item in. And so once we turn that on, then you'll see the fields that I spoke about a couple of minutes ago, the order point quantity and the order up to level. And again, the order point quantity is telling the system to order a quantity that will bring the available inventory up to this number. In my case, 50. And so it's going to look at my available quantity for this 2G proc item, and whatever I have available, it's going to suggest a buy for the difference between that number and 50. And so that's one way to get PO Generator to work. The other way is the order up to level. And so and you might ask, well, these seem very similar. Why would I use both? You wouldn't. I have filled in both so I can demonstrate both, but you normally would only use one of these. And so the order up to level is slightly different in that if it is 0 or less than the order point quantity, then the order point quantity will always be used instead of the order up to. And so you only need one of them. And so you can, again, kind of ignore that I have used them both. I just want to show you the different calculations. So if you notice, in my order point quantity, is set to 50, and my order up to level, I have it set to 75. And so kind of keep those numbers in mind as we run through the calculation here of the purchase order. The very last thing on this item resource planning is the actual PO Generator button up here in the ribbon. And so you'll notice now it's defaulting in from my PO setup. It's defaulting this information into this window. And so remember just a minute ago, we looked at this in purchase order processing setup. Well, I'm getting those values now brought into this item when I set it up to use the PO Generator. So the good news is that this happens behind the scenes automatically, and you can come in and toggle this for each item if you need to. And so that is very nice because this allows us to have the maximum control and flexibility over each item in the system and how the PO Generator is going to respond for this item when we set to buy it. And so you probably wouldn't come in and just change one item to order up to a master site, but you might change a group or a class of items to do that. And so exact same fields, exact same rules here, it's just we can get it now to the item level. Okay, so that's really what we need to have in the system before we allow the software to, or ask the software to do some thinking for us and create our purchase orders. And so let me flip over to the purchasing area page, and you'll probably have noticed PO Generator is on the transaction menu for purchasing. And so when I open the window, this is pretty good in that we can pick different items. We can run suggested POs by different sites. And so if I wanted to do just my warehouse that we've kind of been talking about here, that restricts it for items that are in my supply area called warehouse. I can do it from buyer. Remember, I set the buyer up as Terry Adams on our particular item that we looked at, my 2G proc. And so, if you have buyers that are actually the purchasing folks, this is an easy way for them to just look at their own little world and what things are flagged to them. And then, of course, vendors. So if I want to run PO Generator for just a vendor, or I could do a group of vendors. It doesn't, I'm kind of restricting it to the same item here just because it does that by default. But I mean, obviously I can run groups of vendors there, or I can look at it by item class. And so if I have groups of items and I've used classes in my system, then I can have PO Generator kind of focus its efforts on a particular class. So quite a few options there. And, by the way, this is not just one or the other. And so, I can toggle many of these, and so really I could do all of them if it made sense. And so I can build the screen up like this, that I want to restrict it to the warehouse. Within the warehouse, I want just one item class actually being looked at right now. And so I could set all 5 of these if it made sense to do so. And so we're not at all restricted to just one of those items, one of those filters. And so then a couple of questions down here. You know, these are kind of self-explanatory. Do I want to include demand from subordinate sites? Again, that's probably most of us don't have subordinate sites, but if we were using a master site, we could then tell the system, I want you to look at the sites that are under the master, so in other words, all my warehouse locations, and so that would come into play there. And then include orders with no vendor ID. So remember I said if I don't put my default vendor in there, we can get PO Generator to run, but we're not going to be able to get all the way because it's not going to know exactly what to do. And so we're gonna take that into consideration as well. And so then the last area down here is really just kind of more the response to the PO. So you know, I could set a buyer here if I want to, again, not restrict it up on the top, but if I want to populate every PO that I'm running here and that I actually generate, I want to populate it with myself as the buyer. And so regardless of who the assigned buyer is, I want to put me down as the buyer today on the purchase order, and then that will fill in this user, this buyer ID, that will fill that in on every purchase order that I generate today. And so, you know, that kind of overlooks what might be done in setup and allows me to put my own stamp on these purchase orders for today. And then of course the PO date, I'm in the sample company here, and so it's set to the soon to be expiring April 12th, 2017. And then the promise date is going to default into the purchase order date. I can set that date, just type that date in. So if I go to specific date, I can just put a date in there that I want to make my promise date, or I can pick another variable, which is the purchase order date plus the vendor's lead time. So the purchase order date is going to default to my user date, so today, well in my case 4/12/17, and if the vendor's lead time was 3 more days, then it would do that calculation and make that the actual promise date. And of course that assumes we have the vendor's lead time set up. If we don't, then that's not going to be very valuable to us. And of course that lead time means how long does the vendor typically take to get things to us from the time we order. And so, you know, that's their processing and fulfillment and getting it on a truck or packaged up and out to a carrier and on its way. And so that's going to be individual based on every vendor that's in your system. So I don't really have too much of those things set up, so I'm just going to set it back to today's date or my PO date. And then the last thing is to set the promise ship date to the promise date minus X number of shipping days. And so if we want to have the system automatically figure out and set the ship date, we could run that little calculation if we desired. So really, for the most part, once you come into this window, now that we've talked about it, I'll kind of reopen it. For the most part, you come in, other than some restrictions, and you click the button. And so, you know, if you have your default set, you don't really ever have to think about those going forward. And so I'm going to click suggest. And so very quickly then the system looked through all of my data and made some suggestions. And so you see on the very top here I have my 2G proc, and it knew where to buy that. So I've got my vendor, and you'll notice that it pulled in an order quantity of 30. And so that's because if we drill back to this, and let me go back to my card. I thought I had that open. So let me go back to the card, and when you drill down from the PO generator, it drills really just to the query screen, and it's not really the screen that I wanted, although we could have gotten the information. And so you see down here I have 20 on hand. Now that's overall, but remember the PO generator is actually looking at the site that I'm buying this for, and it just so happens all 20 of mine are in the site called warehouse. And so that's coincidental. That's, you know, if you only have one warehouse, then that's always going to work. But, you know, I have a few dozen in here. And so I know from looking at this that I don't have any quantity of this item anywhere else in the system, in the company. It's all in my main site. And so that's what PO generator is looking at, is I have 20 available, so there's no allocation there, so there's no none of those quantity committed. And remember, I have mine set to the order point, and so the 20 I have available, the order point was 50, and so PO generator suggested a quantity of 30. And so so yep, very good. That's kind of what we would have expected. I'm going to go switch that real quick back to use the 75. And so when we go into my item resource planning for that item, and I say I'm doing this by warehouse, so I have to pull up my warehouse, and there we go. And so remember, my order up to level is set to 75, and so I want, for this item, I want the system to use the order up to level. And remember the rule, as long as this is not 0 or less than the order point, then it will use the order up to. And so we'll save that off and go back into PO generator and start the process over. And so 75 minus 20 now gives us 55, is what PO generator is suggesting. And so remember, these are only suggestions. If I say no, 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 we're not doing that, I don't know what I was thinking, I only want 20 of those, the system puts a little visual cue here saying you broke the rule, but you know, that's okay. It's ticked off, which means it's going to include include this item into the purchase order. And so, you know, if I take it back to 55, it's still going to leave that visual cue there saying you fooled with this. It's not that it's wrong, but somebody changed it, and so it's just kind of, as a user, it's just so we know that that there was a change made. And you'll notice that it's pulled in the site, and so this is bringing it into the warehouse. Of course, I have the vendor, and I've got the last time that we purchased this apparently was $119.96, and so we can go kind of prove that out, so you see where that item is coming from. So I'll go back to my, I guess I should just leave this window open. I'll go back to my item here, and then when I go into my quantities and site, and so we'll bring up my warehouse again. And so here's where we see that Advanced Office is the primary vendor. And so really what I wanted to do is, oops, here, I wanted to actually go into that. And so this will have my, oops, Advanced. Okay, there we go. All right, so we see here the last time we bought this item from Advanced, we paid $119.96. Which most of you know, that's where that number is stored every time we receive a product. That's where the last received cost for this item goes. And by the way, this is where the lead time is. And again, these are kind of manually filled out. So if I need 3.5 days here and 2 days planning, then part of the PO generator, one of those options, remember, was looking at the vendor's average lead time and planning lead time, and so that's where those numbers actually are populated and pulled from. And so the $119.96 is actually what we're seeing now on the PO generator here, and so that's where that number comes from. Now, if I happen to know that it's gone up a little bit, obviously I want to put in as much correct information as I can before I generate the purchase order. And so from here, I'm good with these three, and apparently I found some other things here, so that's good. We didn't even know about those, but I need some more stock. But look at this last one. You'll see I've got a warning here, which is okay. It's still checked off to include, but this one you'll see I can't check the box. And so it's got a red X, which means it doesn't have enough information to create a PO. Well, you can kind of see the gaps here. You know, I don't know the vendor, and so that's a problem. Can't create a purchase order without a vendor. And so, you know, I can pull this thing in, and so I'm going to get a message saying, hey, you've never bought this item from this vendor. Is this legit here? And so, yep, I'll just open that and save it. You get that exact same message in sales order processing when you assign an item to a site. And so that comes up there as well. And so not the same text, but you get the same type of message. And so here, this has got, I grabbed a vendor that had a different currency on it. And so it said, okay, well, what are we doing with the currency? And so, yeah, I'm not going to go through all of that, but you get the idea. You can manually fill this out and get rid of that red X. That will turn that into a purchase order for you. And so let me go back and grab another vendor here that might be have a little more setup done. And so, yeah, so that one, because that vendor is one that I use a lot, it is completely set up. And so as soon as I pop that vendor in there, then you'll notice my red X went away, and yeah, I can set the pricing here to whatever it should be. I can edit the quantity to something that I like, and if I do in fact want this generated out on a purchase order, all I have to do is check the box, and then I'll get the POs done for that. So I'm not going to generate these. I'll just go ahead and maybe we'll just generate one of them here. So maybe I still need to figure out if I'm doing the right thing here, and I don't really want to create purchase orders. So I just simply uncheck those. And so this is telling me I just want one PO for a quantity of 2 to this vendor for this item, and click the generate PO screen. You don't have to print the report, obviously, but this just tells me that it created the purchase order, and because I just did one, it's number 2081. And so and that item drops off the list here. And so then if I go into purchase order entry, of course it's going to be the very last one in here. And so now I've got the PO generated as if I would have keyed it in. You'll see it's set for a status of new, so because I haven't sent it out yet. And of course we know to release it we have to either email that out, which I probably can't do in my image here, but you know, at this point I can send that off. Let me just print it so that we get that status changed. And there's the PO, and so now that's going to go to a released status, and from there it's sitting out there waiting for me to receive, and then allow it to flow on into accounts payable and do the intermatch and whatever the process would be. But that's really how PO Generator works. It's very, very, very simple to run. It takes just a little bit of setup based on your vendors, your items, and the overall system setup. But very, very simple, and really we've seen this really save a ton of time for people. And so I think you know, it's good because it does suggest quantities, but it doesn't force the quantities or even force the vendor. You know, it suggested the vendor based on my setup. What I didn't mention is you could go in and say, nope, this time around I'm not buying it from Advanced Office, I'm buying it somewhere else, and I got a better deal, so I'm going to type in the new price. I have complete control over the generator screen once it suggests the quantities, so I can change anything there that I want before I actually then create the purchase order. So Kim, I don't know if we have any questions pop in, or if we have anybody left on the line, but
We
we'll
do
okay.
have questions. So again, on the right-hand side, under the questionnaire, type in questions you'd like Bryan to address. Here's the first one. It is related to back orders. I assume that open blanket orders would be a problem for using this, as it looks at it as an inventory on back order. Is that true?
Yeah, that is for the most part true. you probably, if you do blanket orders like that, you probably would want to exclude back orders while you generate POs. Of course, you can go in and toggle that that on and off, and so that might be the setting. Will I do a batch and then I go turn it off or turn it on, as the case may be, and do another batch? And so I would say that, yeah, you probably want to uncheck that box if you have a lot of blankets in the system. Of course, if PO Generator suggests a purchase, it's very simple. You can do what I did, is just when you see it, you say, oh, yeah, no, I don't need that. Just uncheck it and then let the rest of the transactions flow through to create POs. You just have to be careful that you do uncheck it, because if you don't and then you get a PO, of course you could kill it off at this point, but you probably don't want it to get through where it's in release status and out to a vendor. So good question.
All right. Okay, I don't see any other questions in the queue. What are some other common questions that you run across, Bryan, when you're working with clients on this?
I think the biggest question of all is when I generate my POs, people will look at it and study this, and the big question is, how on earth did it get this quantity? What is it looking at? And so that's always one that people seem to gloss over, and there's not a hard and fast answer, because it's kind of based on your setup. But if your setup kind of looks like mine, where we're looking at quantity available, it's simply that. It's quantity available, and remember, quantity available for an item is the quantity on hand must less any allocations. And so anything sitting out on an order, now remember, a quote, if you're doing quotes and sales order processing, quotes do not affect our quantity at all, because it's just a quote. But once we have an order, then the quantity is spoken for. So we allocate quantity for orders. Any on-posted invoices are part of the allocation. Back orders, if we have the flag set, would get included in the quantity allocated. And if we're doing manufacturing, if there's anything that is being pulled into manufacturing from a manufacturing order, that would be allocating quantity as well. And so the biggest thing is just remember, it's quantity available, and then looking at either our order up to level or our order point quantity, and then PO Generator should mathematically be calculating the difference. And so if we have manufacturing installed, and we're using it, that is a little bit of a different calculation. We're probably not using PO Generator, quite honestly, at that point, and maybe I'll be so bold as to say we probably shouldn't be, but using more of MRP, and MRP takes into account a much broader array of assumptions when it is suggesting purchases. And so just keep that in mind. If you're on manufacturing, you're most likely going to be using MRP and not this. The PO Generator is really for non-manufacturing, so let's just call it distribution. And so we really want to use this where we're just distributing, we're buying and selling product, in other words. So, but I think that's the biggest thing, Kim, is people sometimes get confused on how it calculated the quantity it's calculating.
Okay, excellent. All right, another question in the queue here. I get a warning sign on the suggested PO preview from time to time, but I do not determine what the warning is. Is there a way to see and know what the warning message or issue is?
Depending on which version you're on, there's not. And even the what I'd call the edit list here, you'll notice prints that there's an error, but it doesn't say what the error is. And so that's been kind of make that a little bigger for you, that's been kind of a point of frustration, is we know we've got an error, but could you not tell me a little bit about what the error is? Now, we can look at this and logically say, as we did before, obviously I'm missing something here like a vendor and a vendor's item, and so it's kind of evident there. But you can imagine if you had a screen like this in real life that, you know, you might have hundreds of rows of information, and it's kind of cumbersome to kind of go through and you know, try to figure out what the heck's wrong with it. And so that's been kind of a point of contention that that, you know, we've all kind of told Microsoft over the years is, could you not give us a little tip here? And in I think GP 2015, and it may be 13, but when I click on the view here, I can actually limit the view to just my error items. And so if I have a huge list, that at least just shows me the error items. But again, it doesn't go beyond that. It doesn't really tell me what is going on. And so, yeah, it's not quite as intuitive as maybe what it could be. Anything else you've got, Kim?
Oops, I was on mute. I'm sorry. No other questions in the queue. So thank you for that. And from here, everybody come on back. The next session, again, is going to be on SalesPad to manage your inventory. And then don't be afraid to check out the product tours as well, where Bryan went over some strong features when it comes to managing inventory as well. So thank you, Bryan, very much. Any last words before folks go?